Welcome to the Wednesday night Bible study. We are looking at the story of David. This is the 16th installment. I'm calling this one Trouble at Home. We're going to be in 2 Samuel. We're going to cover chapters 12 to 15, parts of those chapters. So today we're going to look at how the consequences of David's sin played out. How did it play out? We'll see what was meant when the prophet Nathan spoke for God in 2 Samuel chapter 12, verse 10. Now therefore, the sword will never depart from your house, because you despised me and took the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your own. This is what the Lord says, out of your own household I am going to bring calamity upon you. He continues, before your very eyes I will take your wives and give them to the one who is close to you, and he will lie with your wives in broad daylight. You did it in secret, but I will do this thing in broad daylight before all Israel. And lastly, in verse 14, but because by doing this you have made the enemies of the Lord show utter contempt, the son born to you will die. So buried in this list of consequences, David had opened up to his sin. He had owned up to his sin. He says that in verse 13. Then David said to Nathan, I have sinned against the Lord. No excuse, no searching for a loophole, no pleading. He admitted he did wrong with no excuses. He had sinned against the Lord. And David was truly restored to God. But that one night of sex and subsequent murder produced sorrow and regret for many years to come. The consequences didn't just go away. He still had to live through them. That's what we'll look at tonight. In chapter 15, chapter 12, verse 15, after Nathan had gone home, the Lord struck the child that Uriah's wife had borne to David, and he became ill. On the seventh day, the child died. So we'll look at this event more closely later, but for seeing how there were consequences, the death of their child was the first consequence. Died in 7 days. Then there were consequences that involved other members of David's family. Remember, the Lord said, out of your own household I am going to bring calamity upon you. And then later he talks about where was that? We'll get to that later. Okay. All right. Out of your own household, I'm going to bring calamity upon you. With all those wives, David's household was getting very big. This next event here which is in chapter 13, involves David's oldest son, whose name was Amnon, his daughter Tamar, to a different mother, and Absalom, who was had the same mother as Tamar. So Absalom was Tamar's full brother. So we got Amnon, Tamar, and Absalom, all brothers and sisters. In the course of time, Amnon, son of David, fell in love with Tamar, the beautiful sister of Absalom, son of David. Amnon became frustrated to the point of illness on account of his sister Tamar, for she was a virgin, and it seemed impossible for him to do anything to her. And it goes on. Let's just continue. The three people mentioned here were all part of David's household. Like I said, Amnon was David's oldest son. Tamar was Amnon's half-sister. Okay. So Amnon got some evil, wicked advice or counsel from a friend, Jonadab. And then in verse 6, so Amnon lay down and pretended to be ill. When the king came to see him, Amnon said to him, I would like my sister Tamar to come and make some special bread in my sight, so I may eat from her hand. Tamar took the bread she had prepared and brought it to her brother Amnon in his bedroom. But when she took it to him to eat, he grabbed her and said, Come to bed with me, my sister. Don't, my brother, she said to him. Don't force me. Such a thing should not be done in Israel. Don't do this wicked thing. What about me? Where could I get rid of my disgrace? She's asking him. And what about you? You would be like one of the wicked fools in Israel. Please speak to the king. He will not keep me from being married to you. But he refused to listen to her. And since he was stronger than she, he raped her. Then Amnon hated her with intense hatred. In fact, he hated her more than he had loved her. Amnon said to her, "Get up and get out." So those are some excerpts from that story. You can read it verse by verse if you want. A terrible tragedy, but it was just the beginning of this calamity in the household. Let's look at the reactions of David and Absalom in verse 21. When King David heard all of this, he was furious. Absalom never said a word to Amnon, either good or bad. He hated Amnon because he had disgraced his sister Tamar. It's sad, but David's anger went no further. There was no discipline. Maybe David felt unworthy to judge and correct his son's actions because of his own bad track record of lust. David's daughter needed her father to come to her aid, giving her love and justice, but apparently David did nothing. And because David would do nothing, we'll see that Tamar's brother, Absalom, would come to her aid to remove her disgrace and give her justice. But he didn't do it in the best way. Absalom waited 2 years for his father to act. Because of his father's passivity, though, Absalom's hatred festered into a plot to murder Amnon. It was time for some long overdue retaliation. I'm jumping ahead to verse 28, where he convinced King David to send Amnon to him at a sheep shearers festival. But he wanted them there for more than just to celebrate. In verse 28, Absalom ordered his men, "Listen, when Amnon is in high spirits from drinking wine, and I say to you, strike Amnon down, then kill him. Don't be afraid. Have I not given you this order? Be strong and brave." So Absalom's men did to Amnon what Absalom had ordered. Then all the king's sons got up, mounted their mules, and fled. So the tragedy builds. David has lost another son. In verse 37, Absalom fled and went to Talmai, son of Ammihud, the king of Geshur. But King David mourned for his son every day. After Absalom fled and went to Geshur, he stayed there 3 years. And the spirit of the king longed to go to Absalom, for he was consoled concerning Amnon's death. So after David hears of Amnon's murder, Absalom flees. He goes to live with his grandfather, the king of Geshur. He stays in exile for 3 years. No contact with David during all this time. So David, in effect, has lost 3 sons. So now if we move to chapter 14 of 2 Samuel, that's the story where Joab, one of David's men, convinces David to pardon Absalom and bring him to Jerusalem. David lets him come back, but follows up the amnesty with a string attached. So going to for 2 Samuel chapter 14, verse 23, then Joab went to Geshur and brought Absalom back to Jerusalem. But the king said, "He must go to his own house. He must not see my face." So Absalom went to his own house and did not see the face of the king. So David gave Absalom the finest house to live in, plenty of money to spend, servants to meet his needs, but he didn't give him the one thing his son really needed the most, which would be a relationship with his father. So Absalom was shoved aside for 2 more years. During this time, Absalom begins to change, to the point where he no longer wanted to be with his father David. Instead, he wanted his father's kingdom. For the next 4 years, Absalom very cleverly began making a good name for himself. If we look at 2 Samuel chapter 15, verse 13, we read, "A messenger came and told David, 'The hearts of the men of Israel are with Absalom.'" So this is a very serious problem for David. David had been the one the people loved and followed. Now here was Absalom, by winning the people's love, was on his way to becoming king. So how did Absalom do this? It spells it out in the earlier verses. Let's go to those earlier verses. Chapter 15, verse 1. we read, in the course of time, Absalom provided himself with a chariot and horses and with 50 men to run ahead of him. He would get up early and stand by the side of the road leading to the city gate. Whenever anyone came with a complaint to be placed before the king for a decision, Absalom would call out to him, "What town are you from?" He would answer, "Your servant is from one of the tribes of Israel." Then Absalom would say to him, "Look, your claims are valid and proper, but there is no representative of the king to hear you." And Absalom would add, "If only I were appointed judge in the land. Then everyone who has a complaint or case could come to me, and I would see that he gets justice." Also, whenever anyone approached him to bow down before him, Absalom would reach out his hand, take hold of him, and kiss him. So quite a strategy. It seemed to work. Looking at verse 6, Absalom behaved in this way toward all the Israelites who came to the king asking for justice, and so he stole the hearts of the men of Israel. This was not looking good for David at all. There was a power struggle underway, and with so many people siding with Absalom, battles were about to commence. So what did David do? Chapter 15, verse 14. Then David said to all his officials who were with him in Jerusalem, "Come, we must flee, or none of us will escape from Absalom. We must leave immediately, or he will move quickly to overtake us and bring ruin upon us and put the city to the sword." The king's officials answered him, "Your servants are ready to do whatever our lord the king chooses." So the king set out with his entire household following him, but he left 10 concubines to take care of the palace. So the king set out with all the people following him, and they halted at a place some distance away. So all these facts talk about consequences. David is now on the run. His kingship and his whole kingdom is in danger. Remember back in chapter 12, verse 11, God said, "Out of your own household, I'm going to bring calamity upon you." So the calamity just keeps piling on. To put this in our context, do you ever have regrets of something you wish you had done differently? I'd imagine David was thinking, "I wish I hadn't given into temptation with Bathsheba." And he was also probably thinking, "I wish I had gone to God immediately after I sinned and restored my relationship with God instead of waiting." Unfortunately for David, the consequences are not finished, and we will continue next time. In the meantime, take care, and may the Lord be with you.